Quayshawn, the concept of race is obviously sensitive in society. That's no state secret. I look forward to our conversation really understanding the deep philosophical analysis of race. But I tell you, I have to start with one of the greatest statements I've ever read from a philosopher in one of your papers, that you said, everybody has been wrong about race, including me. So I thought, this guy is just terrific. I mean, I've never heard a philosopher say that he ever made a mistake or she ever made a mistake. So we're going to have a serious conversation, but I got to ask you to start. Why were you wrong about race?
Right. So there's three big views on what race is. At least when we talk about race, is ordinarily understood as a slightly different debate for how race is technically defined in biology. Race is a biological thing, or it's real. It's a biological thing, and it's not real. It's a non-biological thing, and it's real. There's a non-biological thing and not real version, but no one really has worked on that.
Okay.
And I started off arguing that race was a biological thing and real, which is not as uncommon as some people might think in philosophy. But then I realized that the empirical data wasn't going to support that kind of view. And then I tried to move over to it's biological and it's not real. I said, empirical data doesn't support that either. And what I realized was my framework for thinking about race was the problem. And that framework was what I call a monist framework, which is that there's a single answer to the question about whether race is biological or whether it's real. And a pluralist framework is what I ended up adopting, and that rejects that there's a single correct answer. There's multiple equally correct answers depending on context.
Okay.
And that's where I ended up landing.
Okay. Well, ended up for now. It's a process. Good. So what I'd also like to understand is your intellectual history with race and how this, and as specifically as a philosopher.
Yeah. So I graduated from high school in Nashville, Tennessee, in the second to last class of the court-ordered desegregation movement in Nashville, Tennessee. My high school was actually created by a federal court order from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals to desegregate the city. And so we had a very unusual mix of, like, racially mix of students. The white and black populations were very representative of the city, like right spot on, right? No accident. And so it wasn't uncommon for me to see high academic achievement, because this was one of those Stuyvesant level sort of academic magnet schools. High academic achievement in all the different subject matters, in calculus, physics, so forth. But then came around my sophomore year, and we all took the PSATs, and then there was a distribution of the white students having higher scores than the black students. So I was like, oh, that's weird, because I know my boy just knocked out calculus, right?
Yeah.
And then in the same year, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein published the bell curve, which had a very interesting explanation for the stubborn gaps in intelligence test scores between whites and blacks in this country. And of course, their explanation was that there's some level of genetic underpinning. Now, I didn't like that sort of explanation, but I was a big science nerd. I loved chemistry. I loved biology. I really wanted to do that. No one really says they want to be a philosopher in high school. So I was planning on becoming specifically a biochemist. But then I picked up philosophy in college, and it was just kind of just who I was. It was interesting stuff. I wasn't really thinking about going into it until I took a course during junior year in college, and it was a philosophy of science course. It was my first philosophy of science course. And in the course, we focus on sort of the epistemic limits of science. What is science in the position to tell us about the world? And can science have biases that problematize their ability to give us knowledge? And the big book that was the focus of the course was the bell curve. I said, I got to take this course. There's a few courses that come around are just specifically designed for your intellectual curiosities. And so in that course, I really saw the power of philosophy and philosophy of science in particular to give constructive critiques of science. And one thing I remember, because the professor was Richard Boyd, who at the time was becoming one of the world's leading natural kind theorists. He was developing his theories of natural kinds. And he threw out this question in the course. He said, well, look, we're in that book of the bell curve, were they even using race as a natural classification, a natural kind? So this is roughly a distinction between the real legitimate kinds that you can do successful science with versus ones that would lead you down a dead end. An example I like to tell my students is, you could find statistically significant results and disparities between groups, in a lot of ways. So if you wanted to, say, study the distribution of sickle cell disease in the American population, and you sample by political party, you could actually find statistically significant differences. Like this turns out to be a lot of Democrats that end up, dying or suffering from sickle cell disease.
Right.
But then that's really a misleading way of looking at the studying that subject, because the underlying groups aren't natural groups to be studying that kind of thing. The correlation is accidental. It's not a non-accidental stable correlation. So you want to use natural classification to get that non-accidental stable correlation, to get science off the ground and doing what it should be doing. And so that question he threw out is like, are these racial groups really natural classifications for biology or genetics? Just stuck with me and said, that's a really good question. And I wasn't really satisfied with the answers that some philosophers were giving, which was, well, no, race, it's not a biological sort of division. And I'm just looking around, it's like, well, I could swear these are biological traits. People talk about skin color, ancestry. It was just really curious that this was the dogma sort of in academia, the social constructionist. And so I wasn't really convinced by that sort of position. But at the same time, I didn't like Ernestine Murray's position, so I was stuck. So somebody needs to address this. I'm, fairly interested and skilled in this sort of stuff, so I'll do it. So I originally got into philosophy to answer that question. I thought, maybe I can get out in time to still, become a scientist, make my parents proud. But I didn't. I ended up, getting interested in other things, and actually the question that I got into it from turned out to be much harder to answer than I originally thought, because I needed to come up with a theory of natural kinds. I needed to come up with, standard for.
So this theory of natural kinds is a precursor, in essence, to begin to use that methodology to look at race, because that would be a natural kind being a stable group that doesn't have an imposed structure to it, but it would have a self consistency, a self-perpetuating structure.
It is the core of starting a science. So an example I start with in my philosophy of science courses is to really see how science works. You need to look at how sciences get started. And they get started, this philosopher of science called Peter Getzels, I would say, was with generating sort of stable observational regularities, observational laws. That's the stuff that your theories are aiming to account for. Mm-hmm. So an example might be, look at how classical genetics got started, let's say, since I'm interested in genetics and race. And when you look at Mendel's work, one of the first things he does in his classic paper, Experiments in Plant Hybridization, is he starts articulating all these classifications. So one thing he needed to do is he needed to understand species in such a way that it would be useful for studying heredity, right?
So let's apply this now to a linear approach to the logical flow of how you've dealt with race. I am interested in your conclusion, but I'm actually more interested in the intellectual process, the flow of the argument, and what you need at each step to get to your conclusion.
Yeah, so
you start with natural kinds.
Sure. You have to have a standard for biological reality. What's a real biological class? And so for there, I developed a theory that ended up being kind of in between the two extremes in philosophy of science. So one extreme is natural kinds are really grounded in something objective in the world. This is existing independently of the scientists studying it. And the other is it's the exact opposite of that, and grounded just in sort of our conceptual cognitive
Imposed.
Yeah. And so I thought really what was really useful about natural classifications wasn't the ontological status of the properties that essentially constructed the kinds, but it was the sort of work that the kinds get done in the science. And so I remained agnostic about whether sort of oxygen or Homo sapiens are objectively real or not. And I focused on the sort of epistemic work these kinds get done. And that allowed me to develop what I call the theory of genuine kinds or genuine entities to include particulars. And that's roughly a kind or entity that's epistemically useful and justified in a well-ordered scientific research program.
Yeah. And then how does that apply to race?
Well, then if you are trying to make the case that race is biologically grounded, then you're going to need to point out a biological research program. Is it population genetics? Is it classical genetics or molecular genetics now? Is it phylogenetic systematics, right? And so I went searching, kind of like a philosophical fisherman, just searching to try to see if there was any sort of biological grounding for racial classification. I first started in systematics because there's been a long history of classifying and using the term race to classify organisms in systematics. Carl Linnaeus, talking about races in systematics in the 1700s. And at the time, there was some recent attempts to try to do it in phylogenetic systematics, which is this taxonomy research program that tries to classify things as much as possible by genealogy. So it's a really far distance from the Linnaean paradigm, which focuses mostly on morphology and other sort of easily recognizable sort of behavioral differences, linguistic differences, and just focuses on sort of who your family is, kind of. The fundamental sort of unit is a monophyletic group, an ancestor and all of its descendants. And so you're trying to build up your taxa from these monophyletic groups of organisms. Some other philosophers of biology, Robert Andreessen, Philip Kitcher, try to develop phylogenetic notions of race or subspecies, as it's sometimes used interchangeably in taxonomy. And there were very, good attempts. There were strong attempts, but some of my work showed that they still fell short of being genuine classifications in their own research program. So, for example, a cladistic race attempt that was put forth in the literature was that races are monophyletic groups of breeding populations in well-defined species. So if you define a species, say, phylogenetically in phylogenetic systematics as, say, a group of monophyletic organisms where the monophyletic group has deep divergence or has a isolating mechanism sustaining the monophyly. That's one definition from Michelin and Thoreau. So that would be your well-defined species. And then you just look to see if Homo sapiens satisfies that. It does. And then you would identify the races as all the monophyletic groups of breeding populations in that species. So far, so good. Now, in the literature, some people kind of attack this view by saying, well, we don't really have monophyletic groups of breeding population species. But we do. It's just that they're not going to generate these sort of clean, separated trees. It'll be a little fuzzy. So that, I don't think, is the problem. The problem comes in how the term is defined, because breeding populations don't have to be genealogical groups. And so if you're actually trying to classify organisms with that definition, you could be systematically misleading yourself, getting generalizations that are accidental or not.
So now how do you you go to your conclusion, which is racial pluralism?
Yeah. So I couldn't find anything that was working in taxonomy. And then kind of during, this was when I was a graduate student, then during kind of when I was writing my dissertation and getting these results about taxonomy, race, it doesn't look like it's going to work here. So at that point, I was a biological anti-realist. I said, well, look, you give it a shot. It doesn't look like it's going to work. And I actually was working on a book called No Space for Race. And it was going to be a defense of biological anti-realism. I got a fellowship to go back to my place where I got my PhD, Stanford, to do that book, to write that book. And I bumped into a population geneticist, Noah Rosenberg, who had just produced some relevant research from human population genetics. And I sat in on a course where he was talking about that research and other relevant. It was called, I think, Advanced Human Population Genetics. So yes, professors do sit in on courses. Just the learning never stops. And that just completely flipped my position. And it looked so convincing that I became a biological realist. And I said, well, okay, so the problem was you're not going to find race as a genuine classification in taxonomy, but maybe in population genetics. And so I explored that avenue. And the strategy that I took was, well, it's not so much that there's this technical term race that population geneticists find useful and are sort of deploying in their research. It was more along the lines of, well, we have ordinary discourse, namely the federal government's racial groups, which are whites, blacks, Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, and Asians. And the essence of those groups, I was arguing, just are 5 continental populations that population geneticists have identified and have been studying since the early 2000s. So it was kind of a more subtle argument so that there's a biological grounding for some ordinary sort of races. And so I explored that. I said, well, this could be it. This looks like it's lining up really nicely. And but the problem was the diversity of our discourse on race. That result wasn't working for some groups like Hispanics or Latinos. There is no biological population that corresponds to that group. You could have, especially for the federal government, you can have Asian Hispanics. You can get it's just about your culture, right? Your Spanish culture. And so I said, well, I'm not going to be able to defend biological realism. I already gave up biological anti-realism, so really just marching down the list. I tried to revisit anti-realism again and said, well, maybe the complexity is such that there's nothing there to find. And then 2 friends of mine who were scholars and reading some papers that I was writing said, you know what, you're probably a pluralist. Right? And, so I explored that idea.
How would you define racial pluralism, and what are the components of it?
Okay. So in your race theory, there's going to be a part about the essence of race, what race is essentially, what makes it what it is, what makes it identical to itself. And then the other part of your theory is the existence status. Is race real or is it not real? If it is real, how is it real? Is it biologically real? Is it non-biologically real? Maybe socially constructed real? And racial pluralism, what it does is it rejects the impulse to have a single answer to both of those questions.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people say, well, race is biologically real and has a biological essence, or non-biologically real and has a non-biological essence, or something like that. What racial pluralism says is there's multiple answers to the question of what the essence is, and there's multiple answers to the question of what the reality status is. I'm a fan of the multiple answers to the question of what the essence is. So if you ask me, what is race? I'd say, give me your context. And the answer might be, well, it's biological, has a biological essence and it's real, or maybe it has a biological essence and it's not real, right? Maybe it doesn't have a biological essence and it's real, or something like that. So that's the nuts and bolts of the
And how would it work in specifics? I see your mechanism now, racial pluralism, but now apply it. I mean, tell me what the results will be of that in terms of when you apply this pluralistic result, because now you see you have different approaches to the questions, and you have 2 or 3 issues, so you have a much larger a matrix of possible answers.
Right.
And then it depends, I guess, on the kind of question you're asking. If you're asking a medical question, are we dealing with, a certain kind of disease? That's maybe one definition of race. Maybe you're dealing with, I don't know, school distributions in communities and desegregation. You get a different kind of answer. So work with me in terms of how the theory of racial pluralism will have an instrumental effect on different questions.
Good. So your theories are designed to address observational regularities. And there are different regularities that we've been observing. One is the use of race talk in, what you mentioned, medical genetic research. What might be useful race talk there? What might be the right way to think about race there? In that context, it looks like continental ancestry is the right way to think about race. It certainly would be helpful in picking up allele frequency differences and other sorts of phenomena at that level. So if you were to ask a question, say, who are the people in the Asian race? In that context, I would say people with East Asian ancestry to whatever level they might have. South Asians have East Asian ancestry, so they'll be in there. Chinese and other Northeast Asians will have East Asian ancestry, so they'll be in there. And that'll be useful for picking up on allele frequency differences that were disproportionately sort of tucked away in one continental population versus another. Now, suppose that I'm trying to figure out this phenomena that has been ramped up, not initiated, but ramped up during the COVID-19 pandemic, anti-Asian hate incidents. So there, I said, well, there's this phenomenon. Asians in the United States and Canada and elsewhere have been mistreated, talked and abused and so forth in public. What's the operative sort of way of thinking about Asians in that context? Well, it's not as continental ancestry groups. It's actually as some kind of visible morphological grouping that then rules out people like South Asians, right? If you look at the data on who's reporting these to the agencies like the AAPI, Stop Hate Group, they have really good data. South Asians aren't really much in that data. And then other people are in that data that wouldn't have been included from the continental ancestry perspective. So think about Micronesians and Polynesians and Arctic Native Americans. They have phenotypes that make them look like Northeast Asians for evolutionary reasons, and they get treated as such in those environments. So there's actually some data that I point out to my students sometimes of the Chamorro Americans, because the United States, part of U.S. territory is Guam, so there's a lot of Chamorros in California and Pacific side of the United States, and they're wrapped up in all this because they look like Northeast Asians, right? So that's the right way to define Asian for that context. So that's how the pluralism approach can actually solve problems because there are these stubborn phenomena we need to explain that aren't going to get handled with just a single way of thinking about Asians or any other race.